You're listening to Foreign Affairs.
The sources of Russian misconduct. A Diplomat, Defects from the Kremlin. Written by Boris Bondarev. Boris Bondarev worked as Russia's main television networks. Within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, however, Putin's early moves raised few alarms. He appointed Lavrov to be foreign minister in 2004, a decision that we applauded. Lavrov was known to be highly intelligent and have deep diplomatic experience, with a track record of forging lasting relationships with foreign officials. Both Putin and Lavrov were becoming increasingly controversial toward NATO, but the behavioral changes were subtle. Many diplomats didn't notice, including me. In retrospect, however, it's clear that Moscow was laying the groundwork for Putin's imperial project, especially in Ukraine. The Kremlin developed an obsession with the country after its Orange Revolution of 2004-05, when hundreds of thousands of protesters prevented Russia's preferred candidate from becoming president after what was widely considered to be a rigged election. The obsession was reflected in the major Russian political shows, which started dedicating their primetime coverage to Ukraine, droning on about the country's supposedly Russophobic authorities. For the next 16 years, right up to the invasion, Russians heard newscasters describe Ukraine as an evil country, controlled by the United States, that oppressed its Russian-speaking population. Putin is seemingly incapable of believing that countries can genuinely cooperate, and he believes that most of Washington's closest partners are really just its puppets, including other members of NATO. Putin, meanwhile, continued working to consolidate power at home. The country's constitution limited presidents to 2 consecutive terms, but in 2008, Putin crafted a scheme to preserve his control. He would support his ally Dmitry Medvedev's presidential candidacy if Medvedev promised to make Putin prime minister. Both men followed through, and for the first few weeks of Medvedev's presidency, those of us at the Foreign Ministry were uncertain which of the 2 men we should address our reports to. As president, Medvedev was constitutionally charged with directing foreign policy, but everybody understood that Putin was the power behind the throne. We eventually reported to Medvedev. The decision was one of several developments that made me think that Russia's new president might be more than a mere caretaker. Medvedev established warm ties with U.S. President Barack Obama, met with American business leaders, and cooperated with the West even when it seemed to contradict Russian interests. When rebels tried to topple the regime of Muammar al-Gaddafi in Libya, for example, the Russian military and foreign ministry opposed NATO efforts to establish a no-fly zone over the country. Gaddafi historically had good relations with Moscow, and our country had investments in Libya's oil sector, so our ministry didn't want to help the rebels win. Yet when France, Lebanon, and the United Kingdom, backed by the United States, brought a motion before the United Nations Security Council that would have authorized a no-fly zone, Medvedev had us abstain rather than veto it. There is evidence that Putin may have disagreed with this decision. But in 2011, Putin announced plans to run for president again. Medvedev, reluctantly, it appeared, stepped aside and accepted the position of prime minister. Liberals were outraged, and many called for boycotts or argued that Russians should deliberately spoil their ballots. These protesters made up only a small part of Russia's population, so their dissent didn't seriously threaten Putin's plans. But even the limited display of opposition seemed to make Moscow nervous. Putin thus worked to bolster turnout in the 2011 parliamentary elections to make the results of the contest seem legitimate. One of his earlier efforts to narrow the political space separating the people from his rule. The effort extended to the foreign ministry. The Kremlin gave my embassy and all the others the task of getting overseas Russians to vote. I worked at the time in Mongolia. When the election came, I voted for a non-Putin party, worrying that if I didn't vote at all, my ballot would be cast on my behalf for Putin's united Russia. But my wife, who worked at the embassy as chief office manager, boycotted. She was one of just 3 embassy employees who did not participate. A few days later, embassy leaders looked through the list of staff who cast ballots in the elections. On being named, the other 2 non-voters said they were not aware that they had needed to participate and promised to do so in the upcoming presidential elections. My wife, however, said that she did not want to vote, noting that it was her constitutional right not to participate. In response, the embassy's second-in-command organized a campaign against her. He shouted at her, accused her of breaking discipline, and said that she would be labeled politically unreliable. He described her as an accomplice of Alexei Navalny, a prominent opposition leader. After my wife didn't vote in the presidential contest either, the ambassador didn't talk to her for a week. His deputy didn't speak to her for over a month. Breaking Bad. My next position was in the ministry's Department for Nonproliferation and Arms Control. In addition to issues related to weapons of mass destruction, I was assigned to focus on export controls, regulations governing the international transfer of goods and technology that can be used for defense and civilian purposes. It was a job that would give me a clear view of Russia's military, just as it became newly relevant. In March 2014, Russia annexed Crimea and began fueling an insurgency in the Donbass. When news of the annexation was announced, I was at the International Export Control Conference in Dubai. During a lunch break, I was approached by colleagues from post-Soviet republics, all of whom wanted to know what was happening. I told them the truth. Guys, I know as much as you do. It was not the last time that Moscow made major foreign policy decisions while leaving its diplomats in the dark. Among my colleagues, reactions to the annexation of Crimea ranged from mixed to positive. Ukraine was drifting westward, but the province was one of the few places where Putin's mangled view of history had some basis. The Crimean Peninsula, transferred within the Soviet Union from Russia to Ukraine in 1954, was culturally closer to Moscow than to Kiev. Over 75% of its population speaks Russian as their first language. The swift and bloodless takeover elicited little protest among us and was extremely popular at home. Lavrov used it as an opportunity to grandstand, giving a speech blaming radical nationalists in Ukraine for Russia's behavior. I and many colleagues thought that it would be more strategic for Putin to turn Crimea into an independent state, an action we could have tried to sell as less aggressive. Subtlety, however, is not in Putin's toolbox. An independent Crimea would not have given him the glory of gathering traditional Russian lands. Creating a separatist movement in and occupying the Donbass in eastern Ukraine was more of a head-scratcher. The moves, which largely took place in the first third of 2014, didn't generate the same outpouring of support in Russia as did annexing Crimea, and they invited another wave of international opprobrium. Many ministry employees were uneasy about Russia's operation, but no one dared convey this discomfort to the Kremlin. My colleagues and I decided that Putin had seized the Donbass to keep Ukraine distracted, to prevent the country from creating a serious military threat to Russia, and to stop it from cooperating with NATO. Yet few diplomats, if any, told Putin that by fueling the separatists, he had in fact pushed Kiev closer to his nemesis. My diplomatic work with Western delegations continued after the Crimean annexation and the Donbass operation. At times, it felt unchanged. I still had positive relations with my colleagues from the United States and Europe as we worked productively on arms control issues. Russia was hit with sanctions, but they had a limited impact on Russia's economy. Sanctions are a sign of irritation, Lavrov said in a 2014 interview. They're not the instrument of serious policies. But as an export official, I could see that the West's economic restrictions had serious repercussions for the country. The Russian military industry was heavily dependent on Western-made components and products. It used U.S. and European tools to service drone engines and motors. It relied on Western producers to build gear for radiation-proof electronics, which are crucial for the satellites Russian officials use to gather intelligence, communicate, and carry out precision strikes. Russian manufacturers worked with French companies to get the sensors needed for our airplanes. Even some of the cloth used in light aircraft, such as weather balloons, was made by Western businesses. The sanctions suddenly cut off our access to these products and left our military weaker than the West understood. But although it was clear to my team how these losses undermined Russia's strength, the Foreign Ministry propaganda helped keep the Kremlin from finding out. The consequences of this ignorance are now on full display in Ukraine. The sanctions are one reason Russia has had so much trouble with its invasion. The diminishing military capacity did not prevent the Foreign Ministry from becoming increasingly belligerent. At summits or in meetings with other states, Russian diplomats spent more and more time attacking the United States and its allies. My export team held many bilateral meetings with, for instance, Japan, focused on how our countries could cooperate, and almost every one of them served as an opportunity to say to Japan, "Don't forget who nuked you." I attempted some damage control. When my bosses drafted belligerent remarks or reports, I tried persuading them to soften the tone, and I warned them against warlike language and constantly appealing to our victory over the Nazis. But the tenor of our statements, internal and external, grew more antagonistic as our bosses edited in aggression. Soviet-style propaganda had fully returned to Russian diplomacy. High on its own supply. On March 4, 2018, former Russian double agent Sergei Skripal and his daughter Yulia were poisoned, almost fatally, at their home in the United Kingdom. It took just 10 days for British investigators to identify Russia as the culprit. Initially, I didn't believe the finding. Skripal, a former Russian spy, had been convicted for divulging state secrets to the British government and sent to prison for several years before being freed in a spy swap. It was difficult for me to understand why he could still be of interest to us. If Moscow had wanted him dead, it could have killed him while he was still in Russia. My disbelief came in handy. My department was responsible for issues related to chemical weapons, so we spent a good deal of time arguing that Russia was not responsible for the poisoning, something I could do with conviction. Yet the more the Foreign Ministry denied responsibility, the less convinced I became. The poisoning, we claimed, was carried out not by Russia, but by supposedly Russophobic British authorities bent on spoiling our sterling international reputation. The United Kingdom, of course, had absolutely no reason to want Sergei dead, so Moscow's claims seemed less like real arguments than a shoddy attempt to divert attention away from Russia and onto the West, a common aim of Kremlin propaganda. Eventually, I had to accept the truth. The poisonings were a crime perpetrated by Russian authorities. Many Russians still deny that Moscow was responsible. I know it can be hard to process that your country is run by criminals who will kill for revenge. But Russia's lies were not persuasive to other countries, which decisively voted down a Russian resolution before the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons meant to derail the prominent intergovernmental organization's investigation into the attack. Only Algeria, Azerbaijan, China, Iran, and Sudan took Moscow's side. Sure enough, the investigation concluded that the Skripals had been poisoned by Novichok, a Russian-made nerve agent. Russia's delegates could have honestly conveyed this loss to their superiors. Instead, they effectively did the opposite. Back in Moscow, I read long cables from Russia's OPCW delegation about how they had defeated the numerous anti-Russian, nonsensical, and groundless moves made by Western states. The fact that Russia's resolution had been defeated was often reduced to a sentence. At first, I simply rolled my eyes at these reports, but soon I noticed they were taken seriously at the ministry's highest level. Diplomats who wrote such fiction received applause from their bosses and saw their career fortunes rise. Moscow wanted to be told what it hoped to be true, not what was actually happening. Ambassadors everywhere got the message, and they competed to send the most over-the-top cables. The propaganda grew even more outlandish after Navalny was poisoned with Novichok in August 2020. The cables left me astonished. One referred to Western diplomats as hunted beasts of prey. Another waxed on about the gravity of incontestability of our arguments. A third spoke about how Russian diplomats had easily nipped in the bud Westerners' pitiful attempts to raise their voices. Such behavior was both unprofessional and dangerous. A healthy foreign ministry is designed to provide leaders with an unvarnished view of the world so they can make informed decisions. Yet, although Russian diplomats would include inconvenient facts in their reports, lest their supervisors discover an omission, they would bury these nuggets of truth in mountains of propaganda. A 2021 cable might have had a line explaining, for instance, that the Ukrainian military was stronger than it was in 2014, but that admission would have come only after a lengthy paean to the mighty Russian armed forces. The disconnect from reality became even more extreme in January 2022, when U.S. and Russian diplomats met at the U.S. mission in Geneva to discuss a Moscow proposed treaty to rework NATO. The foreign ministry was increasingly focused on the supposed dangers of the Western security bloc, and Russian troops were massing on the Ukrainian border. I served as a liaison officer for the meeting, on call to provide assistance if our delegation needed anything from Russia's local mission, and received a copy of our proposal. It was bewildering, filled with provisions that would clearly be unacceptable to the West, such as a demand that NATO withdraw all troops and weapons from states that joined after 1997, which would include Bulgaria, the Czech Republic, Poland, and the Baltic states. I assumed its author was either laying the groundwork for war or had no idea how the United States or Europe worked, or both. I chatted with our delegates during coffee breaks, and they seemed perplexed as well. I asked my supervisor about it, and he, too, was bewildered. No one could understand how we would go to the United States with a document that demanded, among other things, that NATO permanently close its doors to new members. Eventually, we learned the document's origin. It came straight from the Kremlin. It was therefore not to be questioned. I kept hoping that my colleagues would privately express concern, rather than just confusion, about what we were doing. but many told me that they were perfectly content to embrace the Kremlin's lies. For some, this was a way to evade responsibility for Russia's actions. They could explain their behavior by telling themselves and others that they were merely following orders. That I understood. What was more troubling was that many took pride in our increasingly bellicose behavior. Several times, when I cautioned colleagues that their actions were too abrasive to help Russia, they gestured at our nuclear force. "We are a great power," one person said to me. "Other countries," he continued, "must do what we say." Crazy train. Even after the January summit, I didn't believe that Putin would launch a full-fledged war. Ukraine in 2022 is plainly more united and pro-Western than it had been in 2014. Nobody would greet Russians with flowers. The West's highly combative statements about a potential Russian invasion made clear that the United States and Europe would react strongly. My time working in arms and exports had taught me that the Russian military did not have the capability to overrun its biggest European neighbor, and that, aside from Belarus, no outside state would offer us meaningful support. Putin, I figured, must have known this, too, despite all the yes-men who have shielded him from the truth. The invasion made my decision to leave ethically straightforward, but the logistics were still hard. My wife was visiting me in Geneva when the war broke out. She had recently quit her job at a Moscow-based industrial association, but resigning publicly meant that neither she nor I would be safe in Russia. We therefore agreed that she would travel back to Moscow to get our kitten before I handed in my papers. It proved to be a complex 3-month process. The cat, a young stray, needed to be neutered and vaccinated before we could take him to Switzerland, and the European Union quickly banned Russian planes. To get from Moscow back to Geneva, my wife had to take 3 flights, 2 cab rides, and cross a Lithuanian border twice, both times on foot. In the meantime, I watched as my colleagues surrendered to Putin's aims. In the early days of the war, most were beaming with pride. "At last," one exclaimed, "now we'll show the Americans. Now they know who the boss is." In a few weeks, when it became clear that the blitzkrieg against Kiev had failed, the rhetoric grew gloomier but no less belligerent. One official, a respected expert on ballistic missiles, told me that Russia needed to send a nuclear warhead to a suburb of Washington. He added, "Americans will shit their pants and rush to beg us for peace." He appeared to be partially joking, but Russians tend to think that Americans are too pampered to risk their lives for anything. So when I pointed out that a nuclear attack would invite catastrophic retaliation, he scoffed. "No, it wouldn't." Perhaps a few dozen diplomats quietly left the ministry. So far, I'm the only one who has publicly broken with Moscow. But most of the colleagues whom I regarded as sensible and smart stuck around. "What can we do?" one asked. "We're small people." He gave up on reasoning for himself. "Those in Moscow know better," he said. Others acknowledged the insanity of the situation in private conversations, but it wasn't reflected in their work. They continued to spew lies about Ukrainian aggression. I saw daily reports that mentioned Ukraine's non-existent biological weapons. I walked around our building, effectively a long corridor with private offices for each diplomat, and noticed that even some of my smart colleagues had Russian propaganda playing on their televisions all day. It was as if they were trying to indoctrinate themselves. The nature of all our jobs inevitably changed. For one thing, relations with Western diplomats collapsed. We stopped discussing almost everything with them. Some of my colleagues from Europe even stopped saying hello when we crossed paths at the United Nations Geneva campus. Instead, We focused on our contacts with China, who expressed their understanding about Russia's security concerns but were careful not to comment on the war. We also spent more time working with the other members of the Collective Security Treaty organizations: Armenia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan, a fractured bloc of states that my bosses loved to trot out as Russia's own NATO. After the invasion, my team held rounds and rounds of consultations with these countries that were focused on biological and nuclear weapons, but we didn't speak about the war. When I talked with the Central Asian diplomat about supposed biological weapons laboratories in Ukraine, he dismissed the notion as ridiculous. I agreed. A few weeks later, I handed in my resignation. At last, I was no longer complicit in a system that believed it had a divine right to subjugate its neighbor. Shock and awe. Over the course of the war, Western leaders have become acutely aware of Russia's military's failings. But they do not seem to grasp that Russian foreign policy is equally broken. Multiple European officials have spoken about the need for a negotiated settlement to the war in Ukraine. And if their countries grow tired of bearing the energy and economic costs associated with supporting Kiev, they could press Ukraine to make a deal. The West may be especially tempted to push Kiev to sue for peace if Putin aggressively threatens to use nuclear weapons. But as long as Putin is in power, Ukraine will have no one in Moscow with whom to genuinely negotiate. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs will not be a reliable interlocutor, nor will any other Russian government apparatus. They're all extensions of Putin and his imperial agenda. Any ceasefire will just give Russia a chance to rearm before attacking again. There's only one thing that can really stop Putin, and that is a comprehensive rout. The Kremlin can lie to Russians all it wants, and it can order its diplomats to lie to everyone else. But Ukrainian soldiers pay no attention to Russian state television, and it became apparent that Russia's defeats cannot always be shielded from the Russian public when, in the course of a few days in September, Ukrainians managed to retake almost all of Kharkiv province. In response, Russian TV panelists bemoaned the losses. Online, hawkish Russian commentators directly criticized the president. "You're throwing a billion-ruble party," one wrote in a widely circulated online post, mocking Putin for presiding over the opening of a Ferris wheel as Russian forces retreated. What is wrong with you? Putin responded to the loss, and to his critics, by drafting enormous numbers of people into the military. Moscow says it is conscripting 300,000 men, yet the actual figure may be higher. But in the long run, conscription won't solve his problems. The Russian armed forces suffer from low morale and shoddy equipment, problems that mobilization cannot fix. With large-scale Western support, the Ukrainian military can inflict more serious defeats on Russian troops, forcing them to retreat from other territories. It's possible that Ukraine could eventually best Russian soldiers on the parts of the Donbass where both sides have been fighting since 2014. Should that happen, Putin would find himself in a corner. He could respond to defeat with a nuclear attack. But Russia's president likes his luxurious life and should recognize that using nuclear weapons could start a war that would kill even him. If he doesn't know this, his subordinates would, one hopes, avoid following such a suicidal command. Putin could order a full-on general mobilization, conscripting almost all of Russia's young men. But that is unlikely to offer more than a temporary respite. And the more Russian deaths from the fighting, the more domestic discontent he will face. Putin may eventually withdraw and have Russian propagandists fault those around him for the embarrassing defeat, as some did after the losses in Kharkiv. But that could push Putin to purge his associates, making it dangerous for his closest allies to keep supporting him. The result might be Moscow's first palace coup since Nikita Khrushchev was toppled in 1964. If Putin is kicked out of office, Russia's future will be deeply uncertain. It's entirely possible his successor will try to carry on the war, especially given that Putin's main advisors hail from the security services. But no one in Russia commands his stature, so the country would likely enter a period of political turbulence. It could even descend into chaos. Outside analysts might enjoy watching Russia undergo a major domestic crisis, but they should think twice about rooting for the country's implosion, and not only because it would leave Russia's massive nuclear arsenal in uncertain hands. Most Russians are in a tricky mental space, brought about by poverty and huge doses of propaganda that sow hatred, fear, and a simultaneous sense of superiority and helplessness. If the country breaks apart or experiences an economic, political cataclysm, it would push them over the edge. Russians might unify behind an even more belligerent leader than Putin, provoking a civil war, more outside aggression, or both. If Ukraine wins and Putin falls, the best thing the West can do isn't to elicit humiliation. Instead, it's the opposite: provide support. This might seem counterintuitive or distasteful, but any aid would have to be heavily conditioned on a political reform. But Russia will need financial help after losing, and by offering substantial funding, the United States and Europe could gain leverage in a post-Putin power struggle. They could, for example, help one of Russia's respected economic technocrats become the interim leader, and they could help the country's democratic forces build power. Providing aid would also allow the West to avoid repeating their behavior from the 1990s, when Russians felt scammed by the United States, and would make it easier for the population to finally accept the loss of their empire. Russia could then create a new foreign policy, carried out by a class of truly professional diplomats. They could finally do what the current generation of diplomats has been unable to do: make Russia a responsible and honest global partner.